transcript form, and in English and in the original Yiddish, online, so that students can do original research in these testimonies. And his book is the first book to seriously deal with what these were and how we should understand these testimonies. Very sensitively done. A person who knows how to read testimonies and also to understand them as creative narratives. Alan Rosen is a former student of Eli Wiesel, who is still his mentor. He did graduate work at Boston University with Eli Wiesel. He's the editor of Eli Wiesel, Jewish Literary and Moral Perspectives, and is the editor of a recent collection of literature about the Holocaust. The talk he's going to give today is actually called Tracking Jewish Time in Auschwitz. And until he started doing this, and he's probably going to explain this to you, nobody was tracking the tracking of Jewish time in Auschwitz. What does it mean to track time, to track Jewish time? He'll explain that to you. I'm really pleased that he would come here, that he braved the elements. He says it's going to snow in Jerusalem tomorrow, and everything will shut down. I showed him around East Lansing, showed him that everything doesn't shut down here in the Midwest. Please join me in welcoming Alan Rosen.
Sophie Solberg was born in Munich, Germany in 1923. She was born into a religious Jewish family, one of two children, both girls, and father a bank clerk, mother a housewife, and educated in a Jewish school in Munich, where, as she said, there were excellent teachers. At the time that Kristallnacht, the pogrom in November of 1938 came, her father then retired or lost his job. The family moved from Munich to Berlin. And she was in school for matter of months before it was decreed that Jews would no longer be able to attend school. And she then spent time at home before she was sent to a Hakshara, a preparatory training center for immigration to Israel that had been developed in Germany and other countries in the area in the 1920s. And the one that she went to outside Berlin in 1941 is called Neuendorf. She spent 2 years there, 1941 to 1943, in Germany, which is mind-boggling as we think of the war already having gone on for 3 years, 4 years, and the persecution of Jews during that time to be rife, but yet there was a colony of Jews, as it were, some 80 young people, 25 or so of whom were Jewish, who could still observe the Sabbath day while there. That idyll came to an end, however, in April of 1943, where the group was moved from the training center to Berlin, and on April 19th, they were deported that night to Auschwitz. April 19th was the day before Passover began and the night that Passover began. It was the same day in 1943 that some 550 kilometers to the east, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising had broken out. She and her fellow center youth celebrated a Passover Seder on the boxcar on their way to Auschwitz, having baked matzahs in the camp, in the training center before their deportation. She arrived at Auschwitz, was sent to Birkenau, the notorious part of the Auschwitz complex that had the prisoners work in outdoor details, meager rations, little hygiene, and selections for the gas chamber. She contracted typhus, was nursed back to health, thank God, and phenomenally, in a story of its own that we'll save for another occasion, was moved from there to what was called the Auschwitz I complex, where she joined a group of women in the basement of that complex who did work for the SS, Mag Shemam. She, Sophie Zoberg, laundered the clothes and undergarments of the SS. And the conditions there were far better than in Birkenau, better food, no outdoor details, able to wash, and she, thank God, survived until the death march and was able to survive the death march from Auschwitz to a labor camp in the north of Germany. And after the liberation of Germany by the Russians, Americans, the Allies, she later that year immigrated to Israel, where she lives today in a Jerusalem suburb, completely lucid as far as my last conversations, and hope that she's still well at the age of 91. For our purposes, remarkably, she, while in Auschwitz, authored Jewish calendars for the years 5704, 5705, which correlate in the Gregorian calendar to 1943, 44, 44, 45. Two calendars. And as we'll hear, it's a mystery, to some degree, certainly, how she could do this. Not only the fact that she was in Auschwitz, but to compose such a calendar itself, especially under such conditions, which usually took the finesse of rabbinic knowledge, having a corpus of books at one's disposal where one could calculate certain variations in the calendars, and set that down with the composure to make it readable. But she was moved to accomplish this and did. And we'll hear more about the story and investigate how she could have possibly carried this out. And along with that, the intriguing, intertwined story of a second, actually a third calendar that we know of was made in Auschwitz, two of which have emerged. And they are our guides, our maps to tracking Jewish time in Auschwitz. And only recently have come to light, only recently on the radar screen of scholarship, of even setting aside scholarship, of being known and being something that was important to know. And so we'll look at, God willing, the how and the implications of such remarkable artifacts for our study of the Holocaust, our study of time in general, and how that pertains to our own thinking about our lives connected to time and time's mystery. But while exploring this, and in preface to it, I'd really like to thank so much those who facilitated the privilege of being here with you tonight at Michigan State, Professor Walzer, who's a colleague whose work I respect greatly, and that we overlap in many of our concerns. Professor Aronoff, who, as the chair of the department, made it possible really to have the talk take place, and others, Vicki Gertzel, is that right? Yeah, who administered this with tremendous finesse. So thanking them. And I always like to, because of my preoccupation with calendars, but for other reasons too, situate our talk in the calendar dates that we're at, which I believe are, well, they're kind of here. They're a little bit, one is in one place and another in another place, which maybe that's a nice clue to things. Today was the 29th of Shvat. Tonight is the 30th day of Shvat in the Jewish calendar, 5775, and the 18th of the month of February, 2015 in the Gregorian calendar. Importantly, tonight begins the new month in the Jewish calendar, the month of Adar. And this, while taxi rides are always very interesting, to my car service here, at the very end of the ride, turns to me, as I'm wearing my black hat, and looks at me and he says, "Pardon me, do you mind if I ask you a rather awkward question?" And I said, "That's fine, it's okay." And he says, "Could you tell me what's the proper way to refer to a rabbi?" And I said, "Well, I'll save you the effort because I'm not a rabbi, so you don't have to know about that. But if you look in the back," I told him, "of Webster's dictionary, it gives a whole list of how, if you're going to write to a duke or a baroness or a prince or princess or chief justice, the kind of titles you use." So he said, "Oh, go and look at it." But the previous ride to University of Michigan, the driver talked about, when he asked him my subject, he said, "Oh, Jewish calendars, you mean the month of Adar?" And I said, "How do you know about the month of Adar?" He says, "Well, there's a large African-American man who said, well, we had a lot of Jews that were around us as we were growing up." And I said, "But why the month of Adar?" He says, I said, "Do you know that that's going to start at the week on Wednesday night?" And he said, "No, just lucky, I guess." So, but I think it was more a feeling in the air. And the hallmark, and we'll go into our subject with this as a guide, the featured element of the month of Adar in the Jewish calendar is that we're obliged to increase our joy because Jews triumphed over an enemy during this month. And it's one of the great challenges for any lecture on the Holocaust, a time of such woe, such sadness, that how do we increase our joy, just generally celebrating life, but especially in this month that obliges us to joy while focusing on such a dark chapter of history. So we'll, perhaps at the end, God willing, we'll have time to reflect some together on that. The Jewish calendar itself is an important aspect of Jewish life, like calendars are generally. We take calendars for granted. They're on our walls, our desks, our pockets, often our computers, and it may be that taken for grantedness that has made them really not be a subject of scholarly exploration on the Holocaust. It's not, as I mentioned, been on the radar screen. There's been no inventory, minimal concern. And and yet they really, to my mind, show an incredible dimension of the victims coping with the upheaval of the Holocaust. Because as we know, the Holocaust, which claimed the lives of terribly some 6 million Jews in Europe between the years 1939 and 1945, and destroyed many communities of hundreds of years standing, that it was a time of such upheaval, and yet there was a way in which time was calculated with much finesse. The Jewish calendar, just so we situate, not assuming that everyone knows what the Jewish calendar is or how it's made, it parallels the Gregorian calendar in some ways and differs in other ways. Like the Gregorian calendar, the Jewish calendar usually has 12 months. And the names of the months date back to ancient Babylonia for various reasons. And so the name of this month is Adar, that we've just entered into. The next month in which Passover falls is Nisan. The Jewish calendar is called a lunar solar calendar, a lunar calendar because the months begin always on the new moon. It follows the new moon. But it's also a lunar solar calendar because, in contrast to the Islamic calendar, for instance, which is also a lunar calendar, the Jewish calendar always has its holidays fall in a specific season of the year. So that is harnessed by the solar seasons. So the Passover always comes in the spring. Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, always in the fall. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, always in the fall. The Jewish week is also 7 days, but in contrast to the Gregorian calendar, where we have today is Wednesday and each day has a name to it, the Jewish calendar it has its weekdays not have a name, but rather a number. So there's the first day of the week, the second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, and the only day of the week that has a name is the Sabbath day, which is called Shabbat or called Shabbos in Ashkenazi parlance. Strikingly as well, the Jewish day begins not with the day, but begins with the night. So it's in sunset that the day begins, and it's sundown the next day that the day ends. And finally, for this cursory summary, that the year date, this being 5775, is calculated according to the traditional notion of the creation of the world. So 5 took place according to Jewish calendar 5,775 years ago. Now, when dealing with the Holocaust, how just to, as we enter into tracking Jewish time in Auschwitz, how does it matter to factor in the Jewish calendar? First of all, that Jews in Europe would usually have calendars that had the Gregorian calendar and the Jewish calendar dates on them. So that's what they would use to view the progression of time. I'm just curious, how many of you have seen a Jewish calendar of some kind? Not so many. Okay, well, in our packets, we'll have an opportunity to do that. then when it comes to looking at the Holocaust and trying to appreciate the way the tracking of Jewish time works, since Jews in Europe were conversant with both the Gregorian and the Jewish calendar. So we know that the World War II started as Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. In the fall, on a Friday morning. But in the Jewish calendar, this took place on the 17th day of Elul, which was Elul being the month that precedes the Jewish New Year, and has a retinue of customs, such as blowing the shofar and special prayers that prepare for the New Year. So Jews were already in the midst of those kinds of preparations as the wars broke out. Second, it took place on Friday morning. That's when the bombs started falling. And many Jews in Poland were at that point in the market buying supplies to celebrate the Sabbath day, where there's special meals, special celebration that usually comes. And so they had to try to negotiate finding their way back to their homes in the midst of the astonishing, shocking outbreak of the war. And finally, it took place in the Jewish calendar in the year 5699. So right on the cusp of going into a new century. And we know how, for those of us that are old enough to remember, not everyone in this room, or maybe not even most in this room, but when you go into a new century, not to mention a new millennium, but that there is a sense of all kinds of apocalyptic associations that, while usually are present, that become intensified. And so it was for Jews at that time. When the bombs started falling, when the attacks came in Poland, there was rife speculation among all Jewish communities that this convulsion had to do with the coming of the final redemption into the world, which the Bible has said will be preceded by a terrible war. So all of these associations were set in motion by those that followed the Jewish calendar. And if we weren't alert to the tracking of Jewish time, we would thus miss those associations filling the lives of the Jews of Poland as they were subjected to the ordeal that they went through. There are calendars that we found that were made by Jews during the war, when in hiding. We recall that many Jews tried to flee the ferocious cruelty of the perpetrators by going into hiding, often with Christian neighbors, friends, associates, clergy. And so they were certainly preserving their life, which mattered most, but they were cut off from a world of Jewish time because Christians, for all of the goodness of these people, often keeping them, they did not have knowledge. And so that knowledge of Jewish time had to come from themselves, and they then took to making Jewish calendars. There was materials that often were brought to them, and despite being cut off from time, some with extensive knowledge were able to do that. Also, as we recall, that one of the tactics of the enemy was to make ghettos during this time, where the Jews of Eastern Europe especially would be herded into very poor sections of cities often, and imprisoned some of the time behind walls or fences, and given the chance to have very meager rations, and were compelled to live with poor hygiene and very difficult lives. Often there were interdictions, there were prohibitions against cultural activities and religious activities. But Jews in Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, Lublin, cities in Poland, and then other cities in Galicia, eventually in Hungary. The ghettos were in Eastern and Central Europe, not in Western Europe, except for the ghetto, as it was called, in Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. There were printed calendars in some of those ghettos. So if we turn, just for an idea, to, let's see, the pages aren't numbered. Sorry about that. If you go, I think, 4, 5, 6 pages into your packet. So we see here this page. Everyone have, you don't have a packet here? Can you look on there? And maybe you can pass this over and share it between. Yeah, how about over there where, yeah, I have found the page. So this calendar that was produced in 1944 in the Lodz ghetto. Lodz every year produced a calendar and with meticulous charting of the Sabbath day, times of when it would enter and exit, which was important for its observance, with the specificity of holidays, with other kinds of notations that included the fate of the ghetto, and phenomenally to my mind, it would also record the obligatory fast days that Jews would traditionally observe in the year. There are 4 fast days in particular, and then a 5th is added. The Jews are observant Jews, follow and fast on that day. Now, under such conditions, where food was at such a impasse, difficult to obtain, and where their starvation terribly often occurred, no one was required to fast. They were dispensed with. But the calendars continued to list them because they were the vehicles of tradition. And as my colleague Mark Kaplan has said, that even when the Jews were not fasting, the calendar would. Lodz had calendars every year, numbering something like about 5,500, 6,000 calendars were printed, used mainly in offices, but also circulated to individuals. In Warsaw, we find not a single archived calendar. And exactly how time was kept there. There were secret, tiny calendars. Rabbi Shimon Huberman tells us, printed in 1942, the only Jewish text that was printed that year, against the censorship and interdiction of the enemy. And then there were calendars made in concentration camps, which is our featured element that we're focusing on tonight. There are 9 calendars that have emerged from the different camps. It was somewhat more possible to make such calendars in what were called transit camps, like Westerbork and Theresienstadt, where cultural activities were more often permitted. And in concentration camps per se, it was much more difficult. So the number decreases. But in Auschwitz, there were at least three calendars made, and that's despite the fact that those like Rabbi Sinai Adler has said that Auschwitz was cut off from the world and cut off from time. And that seems to turn two different ways, meaning that being cut off from time made it difficult to track time. So we have some who arrive saying once we got to Auschwitz, we lost track of time. Because one was stripped of all possessions, generally, including watches and calendars, and the enemy seemed to want to afflict prisoners with the chaotic sense of time, which would make their ordeal that much more disruptive. And so for those who took it upon themselves to make a calendar during this time, it really became a way to try to overcome that sense of disruption, to organize time, to clandestinely, secretly, rebelliously refuse to abide by the terms that the enemy had set. And so the two calendars to emerge are strikingly made, both by women. Sophie Zollberg is one, and Anna-Lisa Berinsky is the other. Sophie Zollberg's calendars are the first highlighted on the first 4 pages of the packet, and they're in German and in Hebrew, so it's might be a little difficult for some of you to read and kind of just follow. But you can see those 3 columns that are there that have the day of the week, that the German follows kind of the English pattern there of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday, which is called the Sabbath day. And then the next column is the dates of the Jewish month, here the beginning of the Jewish year, Tishrei, where Rosh Hashanah